the 17th century, the city of Amsterdam basked in a golden age. The Royal Palace, built in 1648 as the city's town hall, is an enduring physical reminder of those heady days. In 1631, a 25-year-old Dutch artist arrived here from his home city of Leiden. His sole intention was to take advantage of Amsterdam's thriving art market and build a career as a famous artist. His name was Rembrandt van Rijn.
He must have a great impact on the self-esteem of artists. You could say in a certain sense he was one of the early modern artists, in the sense that one get the feeling from his work that he was very much himself.
He is a genius. He is an absolutely outstanding, towering person who thinks and expresses and articulates through visual images, somebody with an enormous capacity for innovation.
Rembrandt became by far the greatest Dutch artist of the 17th century, a giant of the Baroque era. He was influenced by the artistic developments of his day, but from the very beginning of his working life, Rembrandt pursued his own agenda. His prodigious output of biblical images was unusual in a Protestant country like Holland. He was also a pioneer of the new technique of etching, while his lifelong series of self-portraits remain unrivaled. Rembrandt Haments van Rijn was born on the 15th of July 1606 in the university city of Leiden. The son of a miller, he was the 8th of 9 children. Details of his early life are sketchy, but his parents must have been impressed with his young intellect. At the age of 7, he was sent to Leiden's Latin school. 7 years later, he enrolled at the famous university there with the intention of studying classics. But already he knew that a life of books was not for him. He had begun to feel his real calling in life: art. Though no paintings of Rembrandt's youth have survived, at the age of just 14, he withdrew from university to begin his training as an artist. His first master was a local painter, Jacob von Swannenburg. He then journeyed to Amsterdam for a 6-month period in the studio of Peter Lastman, a painter of historical scenes. Lastman had visited Italy to experience firsthand the great paintings of the Renaissance. But the young Rembrandt chose not to visit Rome, Florence, or Venice. Already he was making his own decisions and determining his own influences.
He was asked, why don't you go to Italy? And he said, well, why should I? Because there are prints available of all Italians, after the works of all great Italian masters. And Amsterdam is such an important city in the world, in the trading of art. The most important works of art come here to the market, and I can see them my own. So why should I bother and travel to Italy?
Rembrandt decided not to go to Italy. I think the main reason was that he was confident in himself. He wanted to set up by himself. In many ways, Rembrandt's desire to get on mimicked the kind of attitude that was present in the new nation of the United Provinces of Holland at the same time.
The influences a young artist is subject to are very hard to reconstruct. I think one of the most important teachers is not the word, but the influences must have been his friend Jan Lievens, who was younger than Rembrandt, but who was a child prodigy actually. He must have a great self-confidence, and one gets the feeling that he must have inspired in the first few years Rembrandt strongly, and that they then came into sort of artistic combat, so to say. And so his presence, and they may have even shared a studio, must have been of great importance for Rembrandt.
Leavens was seen as having greater ambitions, wanting to paint on a larger scale than Rembrandt. Rembrandt at this point is painting on quite a small scale, and that's a huge difference if one compares his early work with the work of his middle life.
In 1625, the 19-year-old artist was sufficiently talented to set up his own studio in his home city. The oldest known Rembrandt painting dates from that year. For its subject matter, the artist turned to the one book that filled him with enthusiasm, the Bible. This is the martyrdom of St. Stephen, a vibrant, dramatic canvas depicting the execution by stoning of the first Christian martyr. It is known as a history painting, which, at the time, was the highly regarded style of painting. With this canvas, the young Rembrandt proved his ability in the genre.
History painting is painting that illustrates the dramatic, climactic, if you like, moment in a meaningful story, and it depicts significant human action that can teach you. It has an exemplary function. It can teach you how to behave. So it has moral significance and moral worth in itself.
To be a history painter, you had to be able to paint anything. You know, you had to be a good still life painter because there were objects in the history. You had to be able to paint human flesh and the human proportions and human emotions, and you had to be able to paint a landscape if the history is playing in a landscape, etc. So only on the basis of that, history painting had a very high prestige. The work of Alzheimer he took as a starting point. And it is amazing how he develops his own stage direction for this scene. And it's a very clever painting, and in certain details it's absolutely already a masterpiece.
History Hit is a streaming platform that is just for history fans, with fantastic documentaries covering fascinating figures and moments in history from all over the world. We aim to bring you only the most dramatic and fascinating stories of the past through our award-winning documentaries. Find out about the rise of leaders such as Cleopatra and Napoleon in our latest offering of exclusive documentaries. Sign up now for a free trial, and Perspective fans get 50% off their first 3 months. Just be sure to use the code PERSPECTIVE at checkout.
Around a third of Rembrandt's entire life's work would be inspired by the Bible, and his finest religious paintings are filled with scenes depicting Christ at the center of the action. In this 1626 panel, Rembrandt depicted the moment when Jesus drove out the money changers from the Temple of Jerusalem. Rembrandt was not only inspired by the New Testament. In this 1636 canvas, Rembrandt brought to life a terrible event described in the Book of Judges, the blinding of the Hebrew legend Samson by Philistine warriors. In the background, we see the Philistine woman Delilah clutching the hair that was the source of Samson's strength. In the foreground, the artist spares the viewer nothing in climactic drama. Samson's facial contortions are exactly what we would expect from anyone undergoing such a fate. Rembrandt also proved his ability to incorporate further narrative elements into the image, not just the actual moment of blinding. It is an image corresponding to the artistic spirit of the times, the spirit of the Baroque.
The composition as a whole is built in such a way that you can grasp the painting with one glance and then start reading the details. The way to do that is basically by handling the light properly, by sort of fusing certain elements in the painting into one larger lit area. The other thing which the Baroque art was special for is a very subtle play with asymmetry. So that you guide the eye through the use of light and the use of asymmetry, and in that way you bring in a certain motion into the image instead of a sum of parts. In fact, he improved on certain ideas which you must have known from Rubens, by the Rubens ideas. I think he was a great thinker in these pictorial issues.
Another example of Rembrandt's Old Testament paintings can be seen in London's National Gallery. This 1635 canvas depicts the feast of the Babylonian prince Belshazzar and reveals the enthusiasm for exotic jewelry and fabrics that would stay with Rembrandt throughout his working life. This can be seen also in a painting from 4 years earlier, a depiction of Rembrandt's mother as the biblical prophetess Hannah. Rembrandt's craving for expensive, exotic objects led him to purchase large quantities of them, a habit that would eventually cause his financial downfall. But when Rembrandt's mother sat down to be painted, her son's career was just taking off. By 1631, Rembrandt had established himself in Leiden. At 25, he had already taken in his first pupils, including Gerrit Dou, an artist who would later become famous for his intricately detailed canvases. Word of Rembrandt's talent spread beyond Leiden. In 1628, the statesman Constantine Huygens, secretary to Prince Hendrik Frederick, visited Rembrandt. Huygens was immediately impressed, and his influence led to valuable commissions, including this dramatic scene from the New Testament, which depicts Christ raising Lazarus from the dead after 4 days.
Rembrandt liked painting for the Bible, which of course was unusual in a Protestant country because there's this prohibition on images in Protestant churches. He liked the Bible as a source material for drama, rhetoric and action. The whole of human emotion is contained in the Bible, and Rembrandt was a great student of human emotion, so it gave him the opportunities to demonstrate what he could do.
There's a long tradition in religious painting of depicting themes from the Bible. He's more or less in another way involved. He's doing other things than other artists, mainly in making a thorough study of the tradition, the iconography in graphic art, and transferring the themes he found into the art of painting. And doing it, of course, in its unsurpassed technical way, but also introducing a new way of telling the stories to the people in such a way that he always is very keen in choosing a moment in which the core of the story is very brought to its essence.
When you have the intention to make history paintings, these history paintings do not deal with the kind of history we are calling history, but with the histories of the Bible, but also the histories from classical antiquity. And he also painted histories of classical antiquity. So I don't think it was a very special fixation on religion which expresses itself in his work.
Although religious paintings made Rembrandt wealthy, portrait commissions also began to arrive, especially from the rich burghers of Amsterdam. By 1631, Rembrandt had decided that he should relocate to the great city, and his early years in Amsterdam would be the most successful of his working life. Whilst still in Leiden, Rembrandt decided to use himself as the subject matter for his canvases. This self-portrait from 1629 is just one of 20 created by Rembrandt before his departure for Amsterdam.
He managed to create a light and dark structure in his work, which gives you the feeling that the light is, you could say, not spotlighting on the things. The light more and more starts roaming in space. And he was more than any other painter able to combine the use of light with creating a sense of atmosphere in which the figures are acting.
He probably learnt about chiaroscuro from Dutch followers of Caravaggio. The city of Utrecht was a hotbed for followers of Caravaggio. So that's where I think Rembrandt got the clue how to use chiaroscuro to dramatise his paintings. What we get with Rembrandt is that he uses impasto, so he pastes the paint on. So the highlights in white are very often very thick, whereas for the darks he used very thin down oil paint.
In 1631, Rembrandt arrived in Amsterdam. At the time, Amsterdam was an expanding city, built on international commerce. There was huge demand amongst its wealthier citizens for self-portraits. Frans Hals showed how a portraitist could capture the personality of the sitter at an instant in time. This portrait of the merchant Nicholas Raats proved that Rembrandt also possessed an uncanny ability to depict his fellow man.
Rembrandt started only in 1631 to make portraits, and the innovation of Rembrandt as a portrait painter was that what he had learned from history painting he applied in portraiture. That is, that he tried to make his figures act, even if they were depicted by themselves. He sometimes manages them to give you the feeling that they act instead of just stand and sit. But the great strength of a Rembrandt above a Frans Hals is that he deals with light in such a way that light really becomes light. Whereas in Frans Hals you have lit sides in the painting and shadow sides, but the light hardly ever gets that amazing strength which you have with a Rembrandt.
Rembrandt seemed to have a very penetrating portrait style. We get not only the likeness of the person, but we get some sense of their character and a deeper understanding of them. Compared to other artists of the day, for instance Frans Hals was the master of the passing moment, the kind of immediate sensation of portraiture. Rembrandt's is a much more investigative process. He digs deeper into the soul.
17th century Holland saw the creation of some of the greatest portraiture of all time. But it was not only individuals who sat for artists like Hals and Rembrandt. Dutch artists were often called upon to create group portraits, a form of painting which was virtually unknown outside Holland. Frans Hals was the first artist to fully master the technical difficulties of portraying a group whilst still maintaining the individual personality of the component figures. Once in Amsterdam, Rembrandt also turned to this specifically Dutch branch of painting. This is Dr. Nicolaes Tulp, Amsterdam's most famous surgeon of the day. In 1632, this eminent man of science commissioned Rembrandt to paint him at work, dissecting a corpse's arm while 7 of his fellow doctors looked on. The result was one of Rembrandt's most enduring images, the anatomy lesson of Dr. Tulp.
The difficulties of group portraiture is how to arrange the figures, and we know from the few group portraits that have survived by Rembrandt that he really, if you take X-rays of these paintings, you see in some of these paintings at least that he has been searching quite intensely for the right organization of the group.
The first group portrait that he paints in Amsterdam is the anatomy lesson of Dr. Tulp. So Dr. Tulp was a member of the Surgeons Guild, he was also a burgomaster. And we see the anatomy lesson going on. It's quite likely that this was a private lesson rather than a public dissection, because Dr. Tulp is showing how to dissect an arm. He's showing the muscles and the tendons of an arm. Usually in a public dissection you would start at the abdomen. And it's interesting that all of these members of the Surgeon Guild are watching intently at what's going on. They're not blandly staring out at us. And of course the corpse itself plays a role in this painting. It's almost certainly an executed criminal. Criminals' bodies were used for dissection. So what Rembrandt gives us is not simply a group portrait, he actually animates the event into a history painting.
Rembrandt returned to the genre of group portraiture for some of the best-known paintings of his career. But whilst biblical paintings and portraits would comprise the bulk of his life's work, he also painted nudes and a small body of landscape paintings. Many believe that the finest of these is this small canvas, The Mill. Admirers of this romantic scene have included the great English landscapists Turner and Constable. It also provides a striking illustration of an ongoing feature of Rembrandt's approach, a restricted palette.
Rembrandt had a limited palette, so we do get blacks, browns and greys, but he also animated those by quite vivid reds as well. And he was always very keen to build up the surfaces of his paintings. There is an old anecdote that he put so much highlight on the nose of one portrait that you could actually pick it up by the nose itself.
By the time Rembrandt was 30, his talent was renowned in Amsterdam. Rembrandt's social status was propelled by his marriage in 1634 to the wealthy Saskia van Ulenbach, a relative of the art dealer with whom Rembrandt had lived 2 years previously. Despite marrying into wealth, Rembrandt was financially reckless. He loaned large sums of money to friends and spent substantial sums on ancient sculptures, Renaissance artworks, and exotic objects from the East. He adopted an unusual approach at auctions, making opening bids so high that all other potential buyers would immediately lose interest. This would eventually lead to real financial difficulties for Rembrandt. But in the early years of his marriage, Rembrandt's main priority would not be money. In 1635, Saskia gave birth to a son, Rumbertus. Tragically, he died just a few months later. 2 daughters followed who also died in early infancy. By 1641, Saskia bore a healthy boy, Titus. Unsurprisingly, both son and mother would be popular subjects for Rembrandt's brush. His portraits of Saskia and Titus reveal not only the artist's trademark palette and his mastery of chiaroscuro, but his sheer love of his family. If the loss of his infant children affected Rembrandt the man, it fails to reveal itself in images like this. By the end of the 1630s, Rembrandt was not only a great artist in his own right, but was also renowned as a teacher. Pupils came from all over Holland to study in his studio, and many would become significant artists, including Nicolaas Maes and Govert Flink. The prodigious output of paintings from this studio has created a problem for the modern student, because many works that were once thought to be Rembrandt originals have proved to be the work of his students.
In 1968, the Rembrandt Research Project was set up in Amsterdam with money from the Dutch government. Their brief, if you like, was to try to sort out what was a genuine and what was a student painting. And of course, there are also fakes as well. At the start of the century, there were probably 1,000 so-called Rembrandts. By the 60s, that had gone down to 600, and nowadays we probably think there's something between 400 and 500.
To begin with, it took quite long before we had to admit that most non-Rembrandt, so to say, must have been from the studio and from students. But then there are groups of works by students which sort of run parallel and are dependent on the works of Rembrandt. So once you have these pairs of work by the master and a copy, you develop an eye for what is Rembrandt and what is the students.
The uncertainty that surrounded some of the paintings produced in Rembrandt's studio is matched by details of the artist himself. There are long periods of time when there are virtually no surviving documents mentioning his existence, and actual quotes from Rembrandt himself are almost non-existent. We do know that in 1639 he purchased this house, number 4, Jodenbreestraat, in the Jewish quarter of the city. The price was 13,000 florins. Despite Rembrandt's apparent financial success, he borrowed the money to buy number 4 Jodenbreestraat. Rembrandt's marriage to Saskia had brought with it a dowry of 20,000 florins. His individual portraits sold for 500 florins each, and his many students each paid 100 florins a year for the privilege of working alongside him. In 1640, the death of Rembrandt's mother meant a financial inheritance. But despite all this wealth, he chose not to use it to pay off his mortgage, preferring instead to indulge his passion for possessions.
We know from several painters that they had a collection, but it more or less was only paintings and, well, some sculpture and maybe some cloth, but that was it. And the way Rembrandt collected almost every part collectors could collect, antiquities, paperwork, things from nature, and also ethnographic objects, which were the 4 main areas they collected. Rembrandt had all of them, and that's rather unusual.
Rembrandt's financial recklessness took years to catch up with him. By the early 1640s, he was still a wealthy man, but in 1642, his fortunes began to change. In his personal life, it was a tragic year. On the 14th of June, his beloved wife Saskia died. The deaths of 3 children had affected her own health. Rembrandt's only consolation was that Saskia's final child, Titus, would survive into adulthood. Before his wife's death, Rembrandt had completed a group portrait commissioned by a militia company, one of many groups of civic guards that emerged in the larger Dutch towns and cities following the withdrawal of the Spanish. Their leaders were often men of the highest status in Dutch society. Here we can see the high status of Captain Frans Banning Kok. Alongside his lieutenant, he dominates the foreground, with the Rembrandt mastery of light contributing strongly to this effect. All are involved in what appears to be more a narrative action scene than a group portrait. This is a very different image from the anatomy lesson of the years before, and it is possibly the most famous painting of Rembrandt's career, The Night Watch.
The Night Watch is very important, and what's new about it is that before Rembrandt, of course, these paintings were made, but all the compositions were very dull. One had next to each other, and Rembrandt made a new composition out of it, which is very difficult to arrange such an enormous group of people, and also using his very famous Chiaroscuro in defining and structuring the painting. That's what it makes the Night Watch to a masterpiece.
In the anatomy lesson of Dr. Tulp, he managed to sort of organize a group of people in a very direct, telling way. But in the case of the Night Watch, he had this intention to depict the moment in which the chaos of people running around and appearing from an archway into a well-organized grouping, and that is the gesture of the man in the foreground, Banning Kok, to his lieutenant, etc. So there's a chaos which is about to brought into order. And he must have thought that that was the best way to introduce really life itself instead of sort of a military parade.
The Night Watch was one of the most remarkable paintings of the Dutch century, and it also marks a significant turning point in Rembrandt's life. Rembrandt was receiving fewer valuable portrait commissions. It has been suggested that the Night Watch itself was to blame for this. According to this opinion, Rembrandt's work was simply too original, and wealthy patrons now grew reluctant to trust such a virtuoso artist with their commissions. A more likely explanation is that a fashion for intricately detailed paintings now began to emerge, in the tradition of earlier Dutch painters such as Jan van Eyck. Rembrandt's work developed differently, with his brushwork in particular defying the trends of his time.
Rembrandt's brushwork was used as a kind of personal statement. You could recognise a Rembrandt by the brushwork. Some people have actually gone as far to say that he used this very heavily laden brushwork to actually disguise the amount of effort that went into it. By looking at a Rembrandt, you couldn't actually tell how long it had taken him to paint.
Brushwork never is a separate thing, so to say. Brushwork is always in the service of illusion, and you have from early on areas where the brushwork is rough. But it's true that somewhere in the late 40s, 50s, he must have deliberately mirrored himself to Titian, who the late Titian became famous for his rough brushwork, and chosen for a rougher brushwork, but not rough as a means in itself. It had a function at the same time.
After 1642, Rembrandt's commissions were dwindling, and this caused him to default on his payments for his home. And by the end of the decade, Rembrandt's creditors were beginning to grow restless. His finances also suffered as a result of a tempestuous affair with his son's nurse, which ended with Rembrandt paying for her committal to an asylum. But Rembrandt's work was still widely known, increasingly through his work in an entirely different medium, a medium which he may not have invented, but which he brought to an unsurpassed level of artistic achievement: etching. To make an etching, the artist first coats a copper plate with wax, before etching in his image using a needle. He then immerses the plate and wax within a basin of acid. The acid bites through the etching into the plate below, from which prints can then be taken.
The copper plate was inked and then cleaned so that the ink was only could only stay in the lines. Then a piece of paper, a little bit wet paper, was added to it, was laid up top of it, and then you could turn the wheel, and then the copper plate and the paper was transported under this cylinder here, and the ink was pressed out of the copper plate onto the piece of paper. And what you have then is a mirror image of the image on the copper plate.
Compared with woodcutting, the etching technique allows for greater expressive detail than the woodcut technique that had preceded it. From early in his career, Rembrandt exploited etching as a medium in its own right, and the results were a timeless collection of images. Many of these images can be seen in Rembrandt's old house on the Breestraat. Early in the 20th century, the Rembrandt House Foundation was formed, and it has been its responsibility to collect and maintain this priceless collection of Rembrandt's graphic work. This is believed to be Rembrandt's father, who died when his son was just 23. His mother can also be seen in several portraits, but perhaps it is this 1647 image that fully reveals what a master portraitist could achieve with the etching technique. This is Jan VI, an influential figure in Amsterdam. Some years later, Six was the subject for one of Rembrandt's finest portraits in paint.
Rembrandt, a very skilled and extraordinary draftsman, and it may well be that making etchings was a way to bring this quality of his out into the open, because drawings usually didn't get to the public.
It made him a lot of money. It allows for the reproduction of his ideas and the dissemination of his ideas, almost not infinitely, but you can make a lot of copies of etchings, and so that it was profitable for him.
Rembrandt chose the same subject matter for his etchings as he did for his work in paint. This is especially true with his religious images. Here, Rembrandt has again derived his inspiration from the story of the raising of Lazarus to create an image full of light and drama. The moment when Christ drove the money changers from the temples can also be seen here. But of all Rembrandt's religious etchings, it is this image of Christ preaching that best expresses his genius with the needle. Completed in 1649, this is a visual representation of events described in chapter 19 of the Book of St. Matthew, a narrative image that became known as the 100 Guilder print.
It is one of Rembrandt's most ambitious and at the same time sensitive works. The art lovers must have been intrigued by it, in that it is half finished. The whole idea of finish with Rembrandt's work was something which fascinated the art lovers. The whole idea of finish was not only in the case of Rembrandt, also Titian and even painters from classical antiquity, and that Rembrandt stopped at a certain point after having very finely elaborated on certain areas in the etching and left other areas in its sketchy, must have fascinated the print lovers.
The 100 Guilder print, otherwise Christ healing the sick, was so called because it fetched the price of 100 guilders at auction. It was an enormous fee. There's another old story that says it's called the 100 Guilders print because that's how much Rembrandt paid to get his own work back.
As Rembrandt entered middle age, his etchings were amongst his most popular works, and they sold for good sums of money. But by the middle of that decade, the Rembrandt's financial situation had come to a head, and in 1656, he was declared bankrupt. Over the next 2 years, his house and possessions were sold to pay his creditors. The inventory of his objects revealed a diverse collection of sculptures, jewellery, weapons and armour. But not even the sale of all his worldly goods was enough to clear Rembrandt's debts completely.
At a certain point in the late 50s, there were the wars with England, which had a very bad effect on the Dutch economy, and incomes fell. And Rembrandt also stopped, not stopped really, but did not paint so much portrait anymore, which seems to be a quite deliberate action, choice. And these portraits, for which he received often 100 guilders or something, were a steady source of income. So on one side we see a negative effect on his income, but on the other hand he kept on buying precious things and objects, and it doesn't go together, I guess. And that's what gave rise to his bankruptcy.
Remarkably, Rembrandt's perilous financial situation failed to diminish the quality of his work. As bankruptcy loomed, he painted the portrait of Jan VI, which shows his unique approach to brushwork. After being declared insolvent, and despite having no settled Amsterdam residence, his art continued to develop, and the images he created in the last 10 years of his life are among his greatest. Rembrandt's art flourished, partly due to the support of his son, Titus, and his mistress, Hendrikia Stoffels. These two people provided the subject matter for many paintings and etchings. London's National Gallery is home to this fine panel of Hendrickje bathing in a river. In 1660, Hendrickje and Titus set up an arrangement whereby Rembrandt formally became an employee of their art shop with an advance of 1,750 florins. Despite the generosity of his son and mistress, Rembrandt's days of celebrity were now in the past. At this time, commissions to paint the interior of Amsterdam's new town hall were being given to the artists of the day, and they represented a gold rush of opportunity. But Rembrandt was not amongst these artists. Only the death of his former pupil, Govert Flinck, meant that Rembrandt received one commission, the Conspiracy of Claudius Civilius, a depiction of a Netherlands tribe's rebellion against the Romans in AD 70. It was a suitable subject for a confident nation that had only shaken off Spanish domination decades earlier. But the canvas was not well received, and it was removed from the town hall shortly after its completion. But Rembrandt still possessed enough influence to secure a commission for a final group portrait, a painting of 6 members of the Clothmakers' Guild. Completed in 1662, it is the third of the artist's great group portraits, following the Anatomy Lesson and the Night Watch. At first glance, this image seems to have more in common with Rembrandt's first group masterpiece. It is an uncomplicated image, with no great sense of Baroque drama. But it does reveal the older Rembrandt's total mastery of painting human beings as real, living individuals with their own lives and concerns, an ability shared by Frans Hals.
It is absolutely fascinating painting, partly from the way he deals with the subject and partly the way he deals with paint and with the means he used. I mean, there is this group of faces is absolutely superb in its presence, but that is not only through his genius as a painter. He must have thought very much about how to arrange them, and when you read the X-ray you can see that they keep moving and changing positions, etc. And in the end they all look in the same direction. It is as if the people from the anatomy lessons of Dr. Tulp sort of switch their glance to the viewer, and suddenly all of them look at the viewer, and that brings in unity into the painting, and there is a whole literature about what he meant by that, but I think it's still a way to make a group portrait in a history painting.
By 1662, the painter of this remarkable canvas was approaching old age. Sadly, these final years would be marked by still more personal tragedy for Rembrandt. In 1663, Hendrickje Stoffels died. In 1668, his beloved son Titus died at the age of 27. Rembrandt was now a lonely man of 62, with only months to live. But he never stopped painting until the day of his death. And in the final year of his life, Rembrandt painted the last installment in what had been a lifelong enterprise, self-portraiture. This is Rembrandt's final great canvas depicting himself in 1669. This is the highly chiaroscuro painting of himself from 40 years previously. In the interim, Rembrandt continually used himself as subject matter for his paintings. This self-portrait of 1640 shows a confident and wealthy artist at the height of his fame. Taken together, these images have been seen as a visual autobiography without parallel in the history of art, a succession of paintings where Rembrandt never hides his own physical flaws. For many, it is this final canvas that is the greatest of them all. Here, Rembrandt's physical depiction of the face reveals the psychological signs of a checkered life and career. However, this painting from the previous year shows the artist laughing. We know that Rembrandt was experiencing the final sadness and loss at this time, yet this is hardly a tragic image.
To an extent, the self-portraits are autobiographical in the sense that they do trace his changing image. But I think they're more than that as well. They also give us indications about his own ambitions as an artist. Because there are numerous occasions when Rembrandt seems to be testing himself against past artists. There's a self-portrait in the style of Raphael, there's a self-portrait in the style of Titian as well. So Rembrandt, with this sense of what had happened in the past, was emulating past artists.
I think they are a very sustained meditation on the artistic persona of Rembrandt, this idea of what is it to be an artist in Holland in the 17th century, to claim the position of the artist as being alongside that of the writer. And they are enormously inventive and articulate about various dimensions of the artistic persona, but I'd like to separate that from a sense of somehow getting at his true emotions or his angst about something, because I don't think that's what they are about.
Rembrandt's mastery of self-portraiture in paint was matched by a similar ability with the needle, although for reasons unknown he virtually stopped etching self-portraits whilst still in his early 30s. Many of these images were effectively used as sketches for figures that would appear in full-scale etchings and canvases. Rembrandt, like all great artists, needed hard preliminary work to fully bring out his genius. When Rembrandt van Rijn died on the 4th of October 1669, he was a lonely and debt-stricken man. It is said that at the time of his death, he possessed nothing but his clothes and his painting materials. Four days later, he was buried in Amsterdam's Westerkerk church. Such a contrast between worldly wealth and artistic greatness is not unusual in the history of art. But in the case of Rembrandt, it is difficult not to be astonished. Such was the sheer size of his life's achievement. Only posterity has given him his deserved status as the greatest of the Dutch masters.
Without any doubt, Rembrandt is a milestone in the history of art. And what you often see in the history of art, that at the beginning of some development, have such an enormous creative ability that everything which happens after them seems more or less related to it. They throw a shadow which only the biggest artist can escape.
Rembrandt was obviously, I think, the most influential, important artist of the 17th century. He's given us some of the most supreme insights into the workings of the human soul. The German painter Max Liebermann realised the greatness of Rembrandt. He said that when he looked at Frans Hals, it encouraged him to paint. When he saw a Rembrandt, he felt like giving up.
Certain works, like the Jewish Bride or so, are really painters' paintings. I mean, he is really an artist for artists. His work conveys the feeling to everybody that he can project his own feelings in his work, and in that sense his work, like with every great artist, is truly modern and timeless.